So for the last problem, we've been working on data structures. Today we'll do our first problem working with arrays. So let's say for problem one, we have an array of say marks from a certain class. We have marks in percentages from a certain class. So the first student gets 30%, another got 40, another 55. I'm just writing random numbers here, random integers. Let's say these are marks from a certain class, and some students got 60, one got 75 or 74, and we have a high performing student who got 89, right? So from this marks, I decided to ask you, okay, can you find me two marks or two integers within this array that sum up to, say, 100, right? So I give you a target sum of 100. Target sum. Let's call it x so that it's easy to type it out while we're writing our code. So a target sum of x, which is equals to 100, right? So if you go through this array, already you can see that we have 30, what can we add 30 to? So we can't add 30 to anything. 40, what can we add it to? So we see that we have 40 plus 60, it can give us 100, right? Is there any other number? No. So we don't. And let's say I tell you, no, you can't add an integer to itself. So it has to be an integer added to a different integer. So that means we only have 40 from this array. I think we only have 40 and 60. I think that's all we have, right? Yeah, it's just 40 and 60. So the first thing I would do is just traverse through the array. I'll just come up with a simple solution with two nested for loops. We'll traverse through the array for the first time and get our first number, our first mark, and then traverse for the second time and get our second mark, so that when we sum these two marks, the first one, which is from our problem here, we see we have 40, and the second one will be 60. We make sure that when we sum these two marks, we get 100, right? So writing our function, we'll just first write our function. Let's name this function, let's call it sum marks, right? Because we're trying to iterate through an array of marks, right? So now that we have our array sum of marks, we have our input, which is our array marks, and we have our target sum. We said we'll just call it x for this problem, right? Now that you have that, the first thing I'll do, since we'll be iterating through the length of the array, let's just define the length of the array as n so that it becomes easy to type it out through the problem, right? We have marks, n is equals to that, right? So remember I said we'll be doing two for loops. Let's start with our first one to get our first mark for I in range n, right? So for our first for loop, what we do is define our mark 1, right, which is equals to, remember I is an index, so we're just traversing through our array or at each index to find out that number. So now we have mark 1 and marks index I, right? So now after we have our first number, we write another for loop for j in range. But because we already have I selected, the first index I selected, we'll say I plus, we don't want to add the number to itself, right? So we say I plus 1, so that means that first index, we add 1 to it, though we go to the next index, to the length of the array, which is n, already defined. So here we have our mark 2, right? It's equals to marks index j, right? Now we have our two marks from the problem. We can say, what are we trying to do? We're trying to find the target sum. So we can say if marks mark 1, whatever number that is, plus mark 2, that's index j, is equals to, let's say it's equals to x, right? Which is our target sum. If those two are equal, then we return these two numbers, right? Which is mark 1, comma, mark 2, right? So this way we have the two numbers in the array, if we do have them, returned, right? Did I miss anything? Okay. So now that we have our function, let's run it by having our array of marks. We already defined our array here. Let me just copy and paste that. I'll use the same numbers. We can play around with it, change it as much as we want. So we have this, and our target here, x, is equals to, we said we want them to sum up to 100, right? And then we have to print our output, right? Our output will have to call the function. Remember our function, we named it sum marks. Yeah, we have an s, sum marks, with an input of marks. Marks is our array, and x as defined in our input function, right? We have the array, we have the target, and we have our print statement, right? So perfect. If you run this function, you see that you get 40 and 60 like we said before. So the first for loop finds our first mark, then we traverse for the second time, but this time we skip out index I. Index I is the number we already selected for the mark 1. So we add 1 to it, so we jump to the next index, then we traverse till the last index of the array, that's n, length of the array. After we have our mark 1 and mark 2, we sum them to give us our target. If we have those two numbers, which is 40 and 60 in this case, then we return those two integers, which is 40 and 60.